How is that?
Great.
Okay, good to go. Hello, thank you everyone. It's great to be here today and I've very much enjoyed listening to all your presentations so far. I want to start by acknowledging the unceded sovereignty of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is their land I'm joining you from today and their customs and cultures that have nurtured this land since time immemorial. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging and would like to extend that respect to all First Nations people here today. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I also want to flag right away that my presentation includes an image of a dead animal, sexist language, and mention of sexual violence. So I'm studying my Master of Research in Sociology at Macquarie Uni in Australia. The story I'm going to tell today is very much a partial one. That is, I haven't submitted yet, so it's not all done and dusted. Still, I think it's been an interesting journey so far. So, we have two images. On the left is Curtis Cerrone, posing for Good Weekend after adopting a carnivore diet. He says the diet improves his performance as an elite rugby league player. On the right is James Aspey, an Australian vegan activist who posted this to his Instagram, partially captioned, "There's more than enough protein in plants, even for athletes." So why on earth am I showing you this? Well, most Australian men aren't vegan, nor are they posing for photos like this on the day-to-day, but there does seem to be a strong connection between meat eating and masculinity in Australian culture, raised on slogans like "feed the man meat" or "red meat, we were meant to eat it." Generations of Australians have learned that Australian men have a right to meat and that this right is natural. Every year in the lead up to Invasion Day, Australians are told that we love our lamb. And if you've ever been to an Australian barbecue, I'm sure you can easily conjure up the image of a father, beer in hand, cooking the sausages, deftly handing the tongs to his son, whilst a mother mixes up a potato salad in the kitchen. Quintessentially Australian. These practices are intended to foster social cohesion, but they exclude those who do not love to eat lambs, those who are not invited to eat lambs, as well as the baby sheep themselves, who are victimised by Meat and Livestock Australia's royal we. Cerrone's picture here recalls these gendered stereotypes. Meat is strengthening, blood-enriching, primal, virile, much unlike, say, a salad or a watermelon. None of this is breaking news, of course. The connection between meat eating and masculinity has been exhaustively studied, most famously by Carol Adams. But actually, I'm interested in the James Aspeys of Australia. There is a tension inherent to the identities of vegan men, or a contradiction. On the one hand, there is a gendered contradiction, a contradiction between the male privilege of vegan men and their vegan practice, which distances them from a tenet of masculinity, meat. On the other hand, there is a species contradiction, a contradiction between the human privilege of vegan men and their vegan practice, which undermines the human dominion over other animals. So this is a project that at its heart is looking at how vegan men navigate their unique positionality within systems that discriminate on the basis of gender, so patriarchy, and species, anthroparchy. I've called my project Soyboys Will Be Boys because just as the catechism "boys will be boys" is often used in Australia to turn a blind eye to toxic masculinity, I am concerned that toxic behaviour of some vegan men is going under-examined because they're sort of symbolically distanced from masculinity writ large. So that's my topic, but what does the existing research say? In Australia, the connection between meat eating and masculinity appears to be especially strong. One survey of over 1,000 Australian men yielded responses like, quote, "They," in this case vegetarian men, "are pussies that are not supporting the agricultural efforts of our country." Yikes. In other studies, the barbecue emerged as a key site which upheld associations between meat, male sexuality, and strength. Fewer studies have focused on vegan men. However, those that have trouble the notion that vegan men neatly reject masculinity. Justine Johnson studied popular texts by vegan men, including Meat is for Pussies. She found that authors like Joseph present veganism as compatible with hegemonic masculinity, for example, by using violent and sexist language. Vegans are tough-ass sons of bitches, and they need to fight the good fight. Johnson uses the word hegan to describe these performances. These men are so ultra-masculine that they can make veganism manly too. Some of the recent work draws on the concept of hybrid masculinity. That is, vegan men do not strictly challenge hegemonic masculinity, nor do they strictly uphold it. They do both. They are hybrids. However, this really is a sparsely populated research area, and the majority of work on vegan men comes from the UK and the US, not Australia. Moreover, while this body of work is often sensitive to patriarchy, it has had less of a focus on anthroparchy. I mentioned this term earlier, and coined by Erica Cudworth, it refers to the system of domination that props up human dominion over nature. Consideration of anthroparchy, though the word may not be used, is often central to the decision to go vegan. Despite this, only a handful of studies have made critical reference to how vegan men engage with this system. For example, as you can see here, Dr. Oliver suggests that vegan men may intentionally position themselves as saviors to animals, voices for the voiceless. What does this say about how vegan men are viewing a group of people they are supposedly advocating for? I position this research alongside an emerging canon of vegan sociology in an attempt to be more reflexive about how we as sociologists think about other animals. So, the heart of this project is my own experience as an Australian soy boy. At this point, it's difficult to count how many conversations I've had about protein, evolutionary biology, and, God forbid, soy-induced feminization. But these experiences do have utility for my research project. Actually, a key component of my design are standpoint theories, which suggest that my lived experience, in this case as a vegan man, allows me to see things that others cannot. I've modeled my project on some of the aforementioned empirical work, much of which relied on in-depth semi-structured interviews. As one of the first projects investigating this research problem in Australia, interview-based research suits my project well. This design also allows me to center the everyday experiences of vegan men themselves. These experiences are often included out of much of the research on meat and masculinity, and certainly in pop culture dialogues. So in line with these design principles, I conducted 10 interviews with people who identified as vegan men living in Australia. These participants were recruited via 3 of Australia's most popular vegan Facebook groups and range between 1 to 1.5 hours each. The interviews themselves home in on the everyday experiences of vegan men in relation to key themes that emerged in my literature review. So for example, how vegan men think about their identity. I use open-ended questions such as, what does masculinity mean to you, to sample their novel responses, with sub-questions to contextualize their answers. For example, do you think this is how most people in Australia think about masculinity? I'm aware that the vegan men I'm interviewing are not likely to be representative of all vegan men in Australia. However, my sample is appropriate for a study which is attempting to provide in-depth information about everyday experiences. Pragmatically, I had to choose something that I could complete in my master's as well. So what have I found so far? Well, I haven't yet completed my analysis and I'm still thinking through the interviews. Keep that in mind. But even so, some really interesting stuff has emerged. Firstly, Australian antagonism to veganism has come through very clearly and often as gendered. See, for example, this first quote by interviewee 1. This focus on everyday experience comes through in each of the interviews, and everyone I spoke to had some very salient social moments. You can see here in this first quote, people being characterized as a bunch of crying girls, soy boys, veganism as effeminate, especially for men. More notably though, I've been struck by the way that many of my participants discuss veganism. There's a huge focus on science and argumentation and being rational, a general idea that veganism is simply a logical process whereby an individual slowly relieves themselves of cognitive dissonance. Having originally thought of vegan men as partially distanced from masculinity, I was initially confused by this one-sided focus on reason. Although in some ways it's unsurprising. My participants also spoke about the pressure of having to constantly rationalize and defend their beliefs. Veganism for these men is lived as a battleground, and many spoke about how exhausted they were with the same old questions. For these men, veganism is produced in consort with a controlling image of vegan men as emotional, effeminate, or confused. That is, the men I interviewed felt they had to repudiate these stereotypes, and so their veganism was ordered according to the logic of these stereotypes. Indeed, there was a significant focus on tactics, or what one of my participants referred to as strengthening the argument for veganism. For example, you can look at quotes 2 and 3 here. So when somebody throws out the word pussy, oh this, oh soy milk, my response sometimes can be like to refer to the breast milk of cows and say, you know, only one of us is still breastfeeding. And some things should be said as they are. If I'm talking to certain people, I will talk about keywords that are very emotionally arousing. So say, for example, with the meat eating industry, cows are artificially inseminated. That's rape. To me, that's black and white. That's clear, a non-consensual rape act. So tactics. Here, vegan men are intentionally deploying triggering language depending on who they think may be emotionally affected by it. You might say that these men are using patriarchy and their privilege under it as a tool to advocate against anthroparchy. Many of these men were self-reflexive and fluently raised concepts like toxic masculinity and speciesism. However, if all that fluency falls back onto stances like this, I wonder maybe if we've lost something in the process. What else did I find? So several of my participants spoke about veganism as opening up space for them to think about other issues. For example, one participant who went vegan for health reasons emphasized that they eventually became convinced about the ethical and environmental arguments. For them, quote, it started off as one small segment and then encompassed the others. This understanding of veganism as a gateway to considering other issues was a recurring theme, although it wasn't just limited to animal ethics, health, or the environment. For example, consider quote 5. There were things that I absolutely did not give two fucks about. And once I started having empathy for animals and not wanting to harm them, I started looking at many things in my life through that lens and sort of thinking, well, hold on, this is going to cause harm. And you know, while I was always happy to cause harm to other people, I started feeling uncomfortable with that. So it was a slower process to come around to empathy for humans. I was definitely someone who never would have had empathy towards the LGBT community, or would have happily dropped racist remarks, not caring who they hurt. So what on earth is going on here? My suspicion so far, again, is that veganism is in some ways the perfect social justice movement for people who have been socialized to value protecting the weak, but are perhaps too defensive to consider allying themselves with other social justice movements. Vegan men are able to construct their activism however they like without being held responsible by the non-human animals they're advocating for. I need to do some more thinking, but I worry about the effects this is having on all people, within and without the vegan movement. However, veganism wasn't always paired neatly with hegemonic flavors of masculinity. Actually, 4 of my interviewees referred to veganism as a second coming out. For example, I think it was a bigger problem for my family than being gay. And I know in my family, you know, they have this toxic masculinity and they want to take you down, take each other down a peg or two by emasculating each other and taking the piss out of each other and doing all this stuff. And that's fine. You do you, have fun with that. That's not, I don't like to be on the receiving end of that stick. And that's not something that I feel I've experienced with my family. And that's something that I feel I've experienced with my family firsthand, being gay and now being vegan. So it was like, oh, we're going through this again. We're going through this again. Some of these men talked about how having previously disclosed their sexuality made the transition to veganism easier. They had already distanced themselves from certain masculinities, that is. So, as you can see, there's lots here and lots more that I didn't talk about. And also there's more work to do on my behalf. So I'm looking forward to completing my analysis over the next few weeks. For the time being, though, I am grateful for the opportunity to present this preliminary work and happy to answer questions about it. So thank you for your time, and yeah, I look forward to hearing from people.
Thank you very much for that, Alex. Do we have any questions in the chat, or does anyone want to raise their hand?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So thanks for this, Alex. This is a really important research, and I'm looking forward to the results of this. Before I go into what I really want to ask, I was just kind of like doing stuff while I listened. I wasn't really looking at the slides. Have you seen the new article just about Jessica Greenbaum on men who negotiate their vegan identities and how they basically just reinforce patriarchy?
Do you know what the title of that is? I may have, I'm not sure.
I mean, I'll put it in the chat here in a second, but it will greatly inform your study, because it's a really recent one, and it's basically it's on vegan men and how they have to just double down on their masculinity and really don't really challenge patriarchy at all. They fall right in line with it. So I guess my question to you is, and it's hard to ask questions because you're still gathering data and thinking about it, but in the radical feminist spaces, and I'm kind of aligned with this as well, the concept of patriarchy having any kind of role in the future we're aiming for, I find that questionable. I think that patriarchy is in of itself a system based on conflict, hierarchy, domination, and oppression. And really, I would, as a vegan feminist, argue that gender oppression and species oppression are at the very heart of really most social ills that we're dealing with now. So it has been argued in some radical feminist texts that what we need to do is not to reform masculinity, not to reform patriarchy, but actually challenge those gender roles, the gender binary, to the gender system, because it's not just about personal identity. This is a social system that these men are negotiating. They're individuals within that system. I think the system itself needs to be challenged. And I was actually just rereading an old chapter from a vegan eco-feminist book from the 1990s, where they were arguing that, it's not just about reforming, because we need to actually demystify masculinity, because this is a way people think that, you did mention there was a bit of essentialism there. People assume this is something natural. This is the way humans are, specifically this is how men are. When actually looking at how vegans can be, how women have been socialized to be, this is another experience that humans have. But this fetishization of masculinity and hypermasculinity and control and domination and competitiveness, that's something that has to be demystified, and we have to stop feeding into, because that, of course, has ramifications beyond gender inequality. It also feeds into species inequality. So I find it deeply, deeply problematic. Like, not to shame guys who want to do their bodybuilding or whatever, but I do find it deeply problematic that we feel like we need to buy into patriarchy when actually patriarchy is at the root of this problem. And in fact, I do know that the research is there's different takes on it with bodybuilding. Sometimes people involved in bodybuilding are doing it for health reasons. Sometimes they're doing it not for the female gaze, but for the male gaze. But in any case, when I see men who are all beefed up like that, even the language we use, beefed up, when I see men like that, I feel that's threatening to me. What's the need to get so big and strong and powerful? Is to scare others, to dominate others, to give other people a sense that you have power and control. And I think that in of itself is problematic. Although I can understand why vegan men would want to show that we're not weak and scrawny or whatever else, by feeding into that patriarchal kind of norm, I don't think it's doing us any favors. I know that when Game Changers, the documentary, came out on Netflix, and it was like leading on Netflix, like that was important, of course, for challenging the stereotypes about vegans being pitiful and weak. But there's nothing wrong with being pitiful and weak. You know what I mean? Like, it's humans of all body types and abilities. So that was my long-winded way of actually it was my little feminist speech there. But what do you see? What do you foresee as maybe some advice you would give outside of this, at the end of this research, as far as what's the role of patriarchy and what's the role of masculinity?
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate the recommendation at the beginning, and I also feel like I very much agree with you. It was so tricky going into this, because I had this perhaps naive perception that, oh yeah, like vegan men, they've somewhat distanced themselves from masculinity. So of course they're going to maybe embody more of a feminist ethic. But as we've just gone through, that's not at all what came out of it. And rather than embodying that ethic, like I might hope in an idealized version of performances of vegan masculinities, it was very much doubling down. Bodybuilders were a huge thing. A lot of people spoke about social media. In fact, I interviewed a few influencers, and they spoke about how they were taking photos of themselves in the right lights, the right shadows to showcase their abs. But in selling veganism that way, you're totally right. I think you do lose something, and we can go two ways. We can think about effeminate male vegans and maybe raise further questions about patriarchy, which is the way that I'd maybe like to go down, or we can just sort of double down and go, no, vegans can be manly too. It's fine to be a vegan man. And in fact, you can have big muscles, which seems like what is happening. I would say that there are several different masculinities that I'm sampling though. So in terms of what advice I give and where we can move from here, it's a tricky one because I need to think about all of this more, but I see certain people who almost get it, I would say, or are almost there. People that are actually coming into veganism and are discussing emotion. They're not discussing constantly cognitive dissonance and rationality and 5-point questions to get someone from non-vegan to vegan. There's more of a reflexivity there, I suppose. But maybe that's too much to ask as well for vegan men to be more reflexive. I don't know if that answers your question, I'm sorry.
It's a complicated thing. And there's lots of people, the chat is just exploding here with lots of people who have takes on this. But I would also add, while I was listening to your response, thinking there's also so much pressure on folks because of like just ableism, right? And so it's this idea of being weak or soy boy and all and other things that you mentioned in your presentation, like those are necessarily wrong. Like they're human bodies, that they are bodies that function and get us around and help us do things. And then I was also thinking about this emphasis, like these guys probably also, it's not just patriarchy, also capitalism, this notion of I need to be as strong as I can be so I can like do important heavy things and and I guess people doing their hustle on social media as well, like that's a side job for a lot of folks. So it's not just patriarchy. I would say also we need to be looking at disability politics and also be looking at how capitalism shames quote unquote weaker bodies or non-productive bodies. But there's a lot going on in the chat, so I'm going to shut up now and turn it back over to Zoe to. Thank you.
Josephine, did you want to ask your question? I can see you've got one in here around aligning with feminism. I can't ask it. So Josephine said, there's a similar argument along those feminist lines that's been made recently by Juliet Watson and Sarah Casey here in Australia around the kudos and therefore redeployment men get for aligning as feminist. Do you think this happens for vegan men also, Alex?
So what was that, the redeployment?
Yes, around men getting kudos for aligning themselves as feminists. Do you think this happens for vegan men as well?
Yes, 100%. There are so many guys on dating apps that are labeling themselves as a vegan and totally not embodying what I would argue as like anti-species ideology, just putting it on there to sleep with people. That's a rather bleak example, but I think it's definitely a factor, especially, I mean, if you talk about like, you know, the rise of lifestyle veganism as well.
Well, there's definitely more chatter in the chat, but we might move along to the next paper for time, and then we'll come back around to the chatter if people want to keep talking in the break, if that's okay with everyone. So thank you again for your presentation, Alex. It was really interesting. I've heard about your research, but I've never seen you present it, which was really good. And next we have Ellie, who's going to talk about veganism in religious spaces and throughout the religious calendar. Ellie, have you got a presentation you'd like to put up?
I do, yeah. Can I just check you can hear me okay and see me okay?
Yeah.
Right, I'll just share my screen. Check I do it correct this time. Come on. Right, can you see that full screen? Super. Okay, brilliant. So hello, everybody. My name is Ellie Atayee-Bennett. I'm a final year PhD student at the University of Southampton in the UK, and I'm funded by the South Coast DTP, which is part of the ESRC. And the title of my presentation today is Veganism in Religious Spaces and Throughout the Religious Calendar, Experiences of Jewish, Christian and Muslim Vegans in the UK. So I just want to start with a quick disclaimer in that since food is so central to you know, the religious calendar, religious festivities and religious spaces, that this presentation will explore food predominantly. But I do obviously recognise that veganism is much more than a diet. It is an all-encompassing lifestyle. And of course, that is how my participants understood veganism too. So I just wanted to make that quick disclaimer. And one other thing I wanted to mention, as I am obviously tackling 3 religions here, and it is such a vast topic, there's so much more I could say on this topic, but I've just tried to focus this presentation on my empirical findings and just sort of talk about what my participants have shared with me, and which is, of course, relatively sort of new knowledge. So as by way of background, to give you a bit of introduction on my PhD. So my research topic very broadly is looking at the experiences of Jewish, Christian and Muslim vegans in the UK. So there's a whole host of various topics that fall under that. The context of my research is late modern Great Britain, and my research interests relate to the sociology of religion, vegan studies, food studies and late modernity, among others. So by way of a rationale, I'm sure I don't need to convince anyone here just how important veganism is, so I'll skip straight to religion. So obviously religion, we think of it as something that is declining. So is it still relevant? Well, I would argue yes. Recent estimates still suggest that up to 2/3 of the population of England and Wales still identify with one of the Abrahamic faiths. So it's still a majority. And then of course, when you think across the world, religion is still very important to many people's lives. So turning to the academic literature, whilst we are, of course, seeing a huge rise in the studies looking at veganism, where the religious and ethnic contexts are concerned, the veganism is still very much absent from the literature. So it is my hope that this research will help to remedy that just a little bit. So hopefully I will offer valuable insight into how vegan and religious lifestyles come together and complement one another, which will hopefully produce more effective communication and advocacy between vegan and religious communities going forward. So my methodology, so I did my data collection last year. I recruited 36 participants, so 12 from each religion. And the criteria that I set was that my participants had to identify as either Jewish, Christian or Muslim. They had to identify as vegan. They had to be aged 18 or over, and they had to live in the UK and have done so for at least 5 years. I employed multiple qualitative methods. So I did 36 semi-structured interviews, roughly around the 1 hour 30 mark. I also did 3 WhatsApp diary groups, so 1 for each religion, and they generally spanned across 3 to 4 months. So I was able to capture both the everyday and some events of religious significance, so things like Eid, Christmas, Rosh Hashanah, for example. And I also did 6 virtual participant observations, which were basically online video calls where my participants either gave me a cooking demonstration or a tour of their kitchen, so I could explore those more intimate spaces where veganism is performed at the daily level. So now I want to give you a quick background on what these religions actually say about veganism and what is happening in these religions where vegan activism is concerned. So I'll try and rattle through this section because obviously it's quite a lot to say. But in summary, it's totally possible to be a Jewish vegan. And in fact, there's actually quite a lot of teachings that do support veganism. So this idea that it's actually God's ideal diet, that the Garden of Eden was a vegan place. And also it is said that when the Messiah comes, the world will be vegan again. Another verse says that the Israelites were actually punished for craving meat, which suggests that it doesn't even please God for us to be consuming animals. And there's a whole wealth of Jewish values, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. I don't want to ruin the pronunciation there, but that are very much in line with veganism. So things like the prohibition against cruelty to animals, not wasting or unnecessarily destroying, and healing the world. There are a couple of challenges in Judaism that do seem to not be compatible with veganism. So tefillin, which is a leather phylacteries, which Jews will wear during their worship practices, and that has to be made with leather, as well as the Torah scroll and the mezuzah parchments being made with animal parchment. But of course, some participants have found ways around that, either by second-hand purchases or just not interacting with these items. There is actually quite a lot of vegan activism going on in Judaism. We've got various organizations that advocate veganism, as well as various activist rabbis and authors that advocate veganism. So the photo at the bottom there is Rabbi Akiva Gersh, who brands himself as the vegan rabbi and shares lots of information on the topic. In 2017, over 70 rabbis called on Jews to adopt veganism, and the world's first Jewish vegan center was opened in London in 2019. Where Christianity is concerned, given the overlap with the Old Testament in the Bible and the Torah, a lot of the the teachings that support veganism are very similar in Christianity as well. But of course, with the addition of the New Testament, we've also got many stories relating to Jesus's life where he showed compassion towards animals. He was very much against animal sacrifice. And of course, sort of the embodiment of values like stewardship, animal flourishing, which are very important to Christian life as well. And very interestingly, veganism is also prescribed for Orthodox Christians on Wednesdays, Fridays, and during Lent. And there is also a fast called the Daniel fast, which where Christians can go vegan for 21 days as well. Again, there are various organisations that advocate veganism within Christianity, and there is a multitude of books on the topic, some that have been written by scholars, some that have been written by activists. Where Islam is concerned, again, there are no laws against veganism, so it's perfectly possible to be a Muslim vegan. And again, many teachings that do actually support it. So we've got various hadiths. So hadiths are basically sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that relate to treating animals well, being compassionate towards them, and looking after the environment. Interesting, on the note of the dietary law, so a lot of people will probably have heard of halal. Halal just means permissible in Arabic. And the dietary law generally focuses solely on that. But in true Islamic law, there is another concept called tayyib, which would roughly translate to sort of wholesome, pure, lawful, and clean. And that would govern the entirety of the animal's life. And unfortunately, this is often neglected in sort of, the dietary law nowadays. And it is certainly arguable that a lot of these animal products are not actually halal. But of course, a lot of people would have strong sentiments on that. Unfortunately, there's not a lot in the way of vegan activism in Islam yet, but certainly there are organisations that are emerging. The Islamic Veg one at the bottom there is one that I have co-founded, and we are actually undergoing a rebrand at the moment. So planning on coming back bigger and better, hopefully towards the end of this year. But again, numerous online communities and activists, and there is also a documentary in production that will be exploring Muslim vegans. So now to turn to religious spaces and the religious calendar. So food isn't always present in religious spaces, so veganism doesn't always come into it, but when it is present, it can be problematic due to the obstacles to commensality, eating together, feelings of exclusion, and so on. I do want to mention that my study and my data collection was actually conducted in 2021. So some COVID restrictions were still in place here at that time. So some participants didn't feel that they could draw on an awful lot of experience to sort of explain this to me. But nevertheless, I was able to gather sufficient data to paint a picture of what it is like to be vegan in various religious spaces. And it was really interesting that it did vary enormously. Some places were very inclusive and others much less so. So this could impact one's experience quite considerably. So what I generally found is that my participants had to sort of take some precautions or do certain things to make sure that they could maintain their religious practice, but also, maintain their veganism. And this could include things like taking and sharing their own food, eating beforehand, or even avoiding gatherings where food was present. So I wanted to give you some examples of the different religious spaces and experiences that my participants experienced. So this may read a little bit like a list, but I think it will be sort of useful for general insight. So where Jewish spaces were concerned, the top two are really interesting because they're truly two ends of the scale. So one participant attended an Orthodox synagogue, and he explained that there was very rarely any vegan food at all. He was often only able to eat like some crisps or some wafers. And he wasn't even able to take his own food due to the very strict kashrut laws that basically sort of said that people couldn't bring food from outside in case it kind of wasn't kosher enough. Now, to contrast that, in the same city, there is a Reform synagogue that actively advocates veganism and will offer vegan food at all events. So it's really interesting to see how, two Jewish spaces can be so different. Of course, worship practices. So I mentioned earlier that some Jews choose to wear tefillin, which are the leather phylacteries that they wear around their arms and head during worship practices. Some participants had opted for second-hand tefillin so that they weren't actually contributing to the industry, whilst others had already purchased them before going vegan, so they just continued using them. Some other sort of spaces would be things like Shabbat or Sabbath dinner with family, Shabbaton, which is like an educational event, interestingly, at the same Orthodox synagogue as I mentioned previously, but this time they did provide vegan food because they had actually asked for dietary requirements. And also there was a liberal youth camp, which again had embraced vegetarianism and was even moving towards embracing veganism. In the Christian spaces, so church is obviously the main one here. So for communion, it was interesting how some denominations just used a non-alcoholic vegan type wine that was their just default wine, if you like, to use for the communion. So that was very easy for vegan participants to continue partaking in, whereas other denominations insisted on this red wine, and those participants generally opted out of taking communion. Tea, coffee or cake, there was a general open-mindedness. One church even provided a vegan cake from the second week that the participant had attended, so they were very, very open-minded and inclusive there. And some participants just took their own vegan milk, but obviously all the other things that they needed, the tea and the coffee and everything, was already there, and it was a very open-minded environment. Again, Sunday roasts, festivals with family was generally quite easy. Christian workplaces always had vegan options in their canteen, and another participant travelled around the country in a church band, so she had to give her dietary requirements, and those churches were always catering for her. So generally within the Christian community, there was quite a lot of open-mindedness and inclusivity. Islamic spaces were a little bit harder, and the mosque, given sort of the range of different cultures across the UK, generally sort of different mosques would maybe adopt the sort of the food cuisines of whatever whatever their congregation followed, really. So there was a whole multitude of different foods. So some would have vegan options, others may not. Dates were always there, so there was always something that people could eat. It just maybe wasn't necessarily the most filling. And participants got around this by taking their own food, eating beforehand, or avoiding gatherings. One participant had attended Hajj, which is the annual pilgrimage, and he found this very difficult because it was kind of just assumed that everyone would eat meat. He was given meat, just given it to him, and he wouldn't eat it, and people were saying things to him like, well, what's wrong with you? So he found that a very difficult experience. Again, festivals depended how open-minded the host was. Some families were very happy to cater, others much less so. And one other space was a convert circle, which was much more inclusive, but this could have been part due to the fact that the participant was actually on the organising committee, so could control what that space looked like. One final space that I do have to really mention, where food and veganism is concerned, is of course the kitchen. So religion didn't really feature in the Christian and Muslim kitchens, so their vegan experience was probably very much similar to ours. The wider vegan community, so we had sort of like diverse cuisines, veganizing dishes, experimenting with different foods and products. And of those that did share or live with non-vegans, there was boundary management, so things like organizing the space, having dedicated showers for the vegan items and then non-vegan items in other areas. Judaism was really interesting to explore in the kitchen, however, because where they have the Jewish law really does dictate so much more than just the food itself. So things like, crockery and what the items can touch, certain, plates, forks, knives, etc. They had to really take the boundary management a step further and make sure it was in line with Jewish law. But even within the Jewish vegan kitchen, they had to, because obviously Jewish dietary law generally governs animal products, but there are other items such as grape products, products from Israel, and especially foods and things consumed during Passover that would also need to be in line with Jewish law. So turning to time now and the religious calendar. So food is central to the majority of religious festivals and rituals. So veganism can cause obstacles again, especially given that so many traditional foods are associated, sort of with meat, animal-based foods, and aren't obviously by default vegan. But this was very easy for my participants to overcome. They just generally veganized these traditional dishes or would substitute with a vegan product that they were able to source in a supermarket. So The Jewish calendar, there's lots and lots of different events throughout the year. So this is going to go across 2 slides. But generally, there's a lot of different traditional foods associated with each event. So for example, Rosh Hashanah, you've got honey cake, Hanukkah, you've got like donuts, potato latkes, and a few more on the next slide, but generally these aren't vegan. So what my participants would do would just veganize it with a vegan alternative. Some of the events were quite easy. So like Sukkot, food would be eaten in a sukkah, which is basically a temporary shelter. And the traditional symbols for this is the lulav and the etrog. So that's the photo at the bottom right there. So a frond of a date palm and a citron. So they are vegan already. And then Tu B'Shvat, which is New Year for the trees. Lots of fruit is basically consumed at this festival. So it's already very vegan friendly. So again, later in the year, we got Purim. Again, you've got foods that aren't traditionally vegan, but can be veganized. Pesach, Passover, you've got the Seder plate, and there are 2 items on this plate that aren't vegan. And what my participants would just do would be substitute it in line with that symbolism for something that is, of course, vegan. And then one other sort of one I really should mention is Shabbat. So it's the Sabbath every Saturday. So that's Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. As per Jewish law, you have to consume challah, and the Kiddush wine. So challah is the braided bread there, traditionally glazed with egg, but a lot of kosher shops are now selling a vegan version. So it's very easy for participants to access this. In the Christian calendar, the key dates really are Christmas, Easter, and then more culturally sort of the Sundays. So you've got lots of roasts, your Christmas roast, your Easter roast, and your Sunday roast, which again was very easy for my participants to veganize. They would just pop down to the supermarket and buy like a Wellington or something, or a nut roast, or even make their own and just substitute that. And with the rise of veganism in the UK, it was very easy to buy vegan mince pies, vegan advent calendars, and so on. So it was very easy for them to continue observing these festivals, but in a vegan way. And then the Islamic calendar, lastly, so the key dates, Ramadan, Eid al-Fitr, and Eid al-Adha. Ramadan, very easy. You could eat whatever you like. And actually, many of my participants felt that being vegan actually helped them with fasting, and it made it easier for them sort of on a health sense. But the 2 Eids generally were a little bit more problematic. Firstly, because cultural foods generally tended to be quite meat heavy, again, easily overcome by veganizing dishes. But it's Eid al-Adha, which is the really, really challenging one for vegan Muslims. So I have dedicated a whole slide to it. And I apologize for it being so wordy, but I didn't know, I couldn't put a picture on this, even a cute picture, because obviously we know what the content is. So animal sacrifice is a very contentious issue, and it's a very difficult time of year for vegan Muslims. It's a time when they generally feel lonely, excluded, and like they don't really belong anywhere. This is because those that choose not to partake in the sacrifice often experience pushback and stigma from the Muslim community, but they also often feel ostracized from the wider vegan community and have in certain times experienced Islamophobia within the vegan community because they themselves are Muslim. And it can actually even be a contentious issue among vegan Muslims. So I had 12 Muslim vegan participants. 8 of them chose to do a vegan friendly alternative to the sacrifice. And that could be donating money to a charity that would distribute vegan food to the poor community, or even distributing vegan food themselves. And that there were another 2 participants that still lived at home with their parents. They didn't have to do anything, but they said that, when they are living away from home, they will do a vegan friendly alternative in the future. But there was actually 2 participants that continued to pay for the sacrifice, and this is because they considered it to be an obligation, and they felt that it would be wrong for them to question the religion, and so they sort of understood this as to be their one break from veganism in the year, and that there was nothing they could do about it. So I'll just end this presentation on a quick note of what does Islam actually say about the animal sacrifice. Well, there is only one school of thought that does actually consider it obligatory. All of the others just what translates to strongly recommended, which means it's good to do, but you're not punished if you don't. So in essence, you don't have to do it. But interestingly, in recent years, there have been a couple of scholars that have now actually recommended against the sacrifice because they do recognise all of the harms involved, the animal welfare issues, and of course, the waste and the harm to the environment. So I am hopeful that there will be a move away from this going into the future. So that leads me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. You can connect with me here, and I will plan to put my slides on my website, hopefully later today or tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellie. That was really interesting. I'd never thought about any of that before. Really? That was good. Does anyone have any questions in the chat? Oh, have I got 2 hands up already? Nella, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, I would love to ask one. That was very interesting. Thank you so much for all this valuable information. Disclaimer first, I was baptized and raised as an Orthodox Christian. So I'll refrain from talking for other religions. I'll just talk for the one I know. And my question is, although you are right, and being vegan and trying to practice religion can be inconvenient at times due to the role of food in the celebrations and everything, and it's especially difficult here when we have awful practices like putting whole individuals on a spit during Easter Sunday and doing horrific stuff. But my question is, even if the food problem is accommodated and vegans can participate, or at least are not, excluded from celebrations, can religion be really compatible with veganism, in the sense that religion is inherently oppressive, in my opinion? And even if it's not, it is oppressive to other animals, because you have all these rituals, and you also have notions about animals not having a soul, and therefore being inherently less worthy than humans. But they are also oppressive to queer people, to women. Again, I'm speaking about Greek Orthodox Church, because Orthodox Christianity here is like the religion of the state. So it has it is really powerful and sometimes dictates policies. So even if the food problem is resolved, it seems really contradictory to be a vegan and religious person, because even if they accept that animals should not be hurt or abused or whatever, they actively, the church as an institution, they actively oppress humans. So my question is, shouldn't we just cut ties with religions in general and accept the fact that most vegans are atheists, and veganism is more compatible with atheism?
So my answer to that would be very briefly is that there's an awful lot of people in the world that are not going to let go of religion. So if we give up on sort of trying to draw them towards veganism, then that's basically accepting that, the future of this world is going to be full of oppression and, a continuation of exploitation of animals. And well, I, for one, refuse to believe that. And I perhaps I'm an optimist, but I truly believe that there is plenty of reasons within all of these religious traditions that say that we can be vegan. So sort of some of the theories I haven't included in this presentation, but that will be a huge part of my thesis, and sort of tie more in with that sociology of religion and religion in late modernity, especially within the context of the UK, is that there is certainly a move towards like reflexive religiosity, the reinterpretation of sort of religious teachings and so on, and I guess a re-emphasis of the ethical side of religion, because I want to say all of my participants, if it wasn't all, it was, very nearly all, they had a very a reflexive understanding of religion. They really emphasized those ethical teachings, and they would sort of say, basically what you've just said, this is only one discourse that is told to us in religion. Actually, if you sit down and look at the religion, there's all these values of compassion and mercy and, all these ethics that are in line with veganism. Is just drawing those back out, challenging those dominant discourses that are oppressive, and that, do maintain that exploitation and oppression and that, and just sort of, I guess, replacing them with what I would say is that ethical spirit of religion that was there at the very beginning of religion, but then patriarchy and all these other influential features took over and have led religion down a more oppressive path. I mean, I truly believe that there is an ethical spirit to the religion. We just got to strip all that culture, all that oppression and everything back to reveal it again. And it's my hope that if we can then sort of help religious adherents re-engage with that ethical side, they can realize that actually, you know, the true spirit of religion is very much compatible with veganism. It's just bringing that back to the fore.
Thank you.
Okay, and Corey, did you have a question before we move on?
Yeah, I just actually want to jump on what Nella was just saying there. I think that we do have some data here that we can work with, not just kind of guessing and hoping. You know, historically speaking, religion's been an institution of control, end of, period. There can be good things in it. There's also can be really bad things about it. We do know, sociologically, we do know that at least in the West, we're secularizing, especially at the coming of the Industrial Revolution. It undermined the power of the church. And so now we kind of look to new institutions of control. So we are also seeing not just a waning of the power of the church, but also increasing atheism and agnosticism, yep, amongst people. So my question is, why not focus on, or why not include atheists and agnostics? Because actually, I was doing a study several years ago about politics and veganism, and I just happened to ask people what their religious identification was. I wasn't even actively looking for this. And 3/4 of my respondents reported that they were either agnostic or atheist, most of them being atheists. And so I really wonder why we feel so kind of driven to focus our outreach on religion when historically religion has not been vegan friendly, period. It just has not. We can find areas of it where, yeah, we can kind of, oh yeah, the Garden of Eden this or blah, 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 that, but that's part of it. Like we're kind of grasping for straws, I think, when the actual majority of these religious, and not just masculine patriarchal religions either, feminized religions as well. Like if you look at witchcraft and paganism and Wicca, which are more feminine, there's a lot of animal exploitation and entitlement in those as well. I think that those systems themselves need to be challenged, and we need to be thinking about not just trying to pander to these systems that have historically been sources of oppression, but start looking at the society secularizing. So why don't we pay attention to what is it like to be an atheist and a vegan in a society where being an atheist is considered, as an American, it's considered being worse than a rapist, considered being like a terrorist. There's research that shows that. Why don't we think about what is it like to be a vegan agnostic? So I think that increasingly we need to start paying attention, just not to organized religion, but what is it like to be in no part of no religion at all? So I wondered if you thought about that at all, and when you're setting up your sampling, like have you considered looking at any atheist communal events and see how they negotiate with veganism? I think there's some interesting stuff there.
So when I first was thinking about doing a PhD, I wanted to tackle sort of every belief system and non-belief system in the world, but my supervisor said to me, you know, just focus on something doable. Hence why I've focused on the Abrahamic faith, because you know, with Christianity and Islam being the two largest religions in the world, it obviously covers, you know, a huge demographic in the world, and of course with the, you know, with there being so few studies in the academic literature that do tackle the religious context, that was my sort of gap that I could contribute to. But certainly I know I have actually mentioned this to my supervisors and to a few other colleagues, that perhaps once I finish my PhD, I could then do maybe for a postdoc or something with looking at the atheist demographic and doing a contrast or a comparison to see how, you know, how that differs, because obviously, you know, atheism is still another demographic very important to explore. It just so happens I decided to look at the religions first, partly because of my own experience as a vegan Muslim and having difficulty sort of interacting with Islamic spaces and with the Islamic community. And I was just really keen to sort of find ways to communicate with these communities and say, actually, we can be vegan in these faiths. So it was, yeah, sort of a personal motivation there as well. But certainly, you know, with religion and beliefs and, you know, non-belief and all that being such a huge central part of a person's identity and everyday life, we certainly need to tackle it, but that doesn't mean to say that we should neglect the atheist side as well. That is something that I hope to do in the future if no one beats me to it.
Before we keep going, can I just check if we have Archer in our group, because I can't see them in the chat and they're supposed to be presenting next. If you are here, can you raise your hand? And if I don't see any hands raised, Jessica, did you want to ask a question? We'll fill up this time with one more question. I'm going to say we're good to go with the question if you want to ask it. Has the urge gone away? Perhaps. All right, maybe we'll move on to our last paper, and then if you want to keep chatting, you'll have not quite an hour break because we've chatted for a while, but that's okay. So I think, oh, computer's been something strange. Our last presentation for this section should be Kadri Aavik, who's talking about understanding vegan transition experiences through the narratives of vegan men. Kadri, have you got a presentation you want to bring up?
Yes, but I just saw in the chat that Jessica said she wanted to ask a question, but the mic is not working. I don't know.
Yeah, actually, I got my mic working. Can you hear me?
All right.
Oh, excellent.
So
Go
I just
ahead.
wanted to actually, I just actually wanted to say I was really excited about this research, Ellie, and I am, what if I get a sabbatical? My research is on Jewish veganism, and I want to say a couple of things about this. First of all, we have to recognize that Judaism is not just a religion. In fact, for many people, it has nothing to do with religion. It is an ethno-religion. It is a people. It is a, and yes, there is so much about Judaism that is like old and like barbaric. And there is also so much that is progressive. And I think there's a big space in Judaism that is, even based in Torah, that is about veganism. So I'm interested in talking to you more about that. I also just wanted to spread that to everybody. I have been coming closer to Judaism as I'm deconstructing it from Christianity, actually, because they have defined it. This is what I learned on TikTok, by the way. They have really made Judaism a religion through their eyes, and they have actually kind of bastardized so much of it. So I'm not going to continue with that, but I'm happy to talk to anybody about that at any time in the future. So thank you.
Thanks.
Excellent. Well, Kadri, do you want to go when you're ready?
Yes, I will just share my slides. It will take a minute. Let me find them. All right, I'll just make them bigger. Right. Can you see?
Yes, looks good.
Great, thanks. And thanks for having me. And I really appreciated those previous presentations in this session and earlier today. It's been fascinating. Okay, so I'm gonna be talking about vegan transition and looking at these vegan transition experiences through the narratives of vegan men, and kind of trying to understand masculinity in this process. So this is part of my upcoming book that I kind of wanted to just show here. So this book is titled Contesting Anthropocentric Masculinities Through Veganism, Lived Experiences of Vegan Men. And it will be hopefully out, actually, it might be even out at the end of this year. So the publisher is kind of rushing with this, but definitely at the beginning of next year. So there's a chapter in the book on vegan transition, but also there are other themes represented, like like how the men define veganism, what it means for them, then their relationships with friends, with family members, and also this crucial question that we've been kind of talking about today, how men's veganism relates to gender equality and other kind of social justice issues. And so that's really important that I try to talk about that in a book. And actually I also kind of theorize on the term of the notion of vegan masculinity. And this book is based on interviews with 61 vegan men in Northern Europe, so in Finland and Estonia. I'm based in Estonia. All right, so I tried to condense into kind of 15 minutes very shortly, basically what some of the things that I'm saying in that chapter on the transition experiences, and trying to understand how the vegan transition process is gendered, and particularly looking at the significance of masculinity in that process. And very broadly, so I have critical animal studies, vegan studies, and critical studies on men and masculinities that I rely on, as well as ecofeminism and intersectionality, kind of as very broad frameworks or perspectives. And in the book too, I kind of spent some time talking about like what veganism actually means, because there are these very contested meanings out there as well. Some talk about it as a lifestyle, and others kind of I see it as much more than that. But yeah, for me, and in this book and in this chapter as well, I talk about veganism as embodied practice and as a relational practice. And definitely the material and discursive elements here are very intertwined. So it's both of this, and also gendered and involving emotional and affective experiences. And I also kind of see veganism, I kind of talk about doing veganism and doing gender in everyday interaction, and they're very much interlinked. So any performance of veganism is always judged through the lens of gender. So it's been mentioned today as well in Alex's presentation, definitely this ambivalent relationship between veganism, men and masculinities. And there's a bunch of studies on this, that explore these links between men, masculinities and veganism. Some of them are in vegetarianism as well. And basically they kind of, if I were to summarize very kind of broadly, they suggest that veganism can offer some potential for men to do masculinity differently, but then also like they also say that vegan men do not necessarily challenge gendered and other power relations, and may also reinforce conventional masculinity norms, like the discussion that we had earlier about this. So cultural representations of vegan men and vegan masculinity are kind of interesting and problematic from a gender perspective. So on the one hand, perhaps there's this effeminate soy boy, and then on the other kind of end, there's that hyper-masculine vegan. So it's kind of opposing, in a way, representations that we have. And actually, when I looked at earlier research on vegan transition experiences, there's not so much, at least I couldn't find much. And there's one study by Stevens Griffin in the UK looking at turning points in the biographies of UK-based vegans, and he identifies kind of as important turning points, family relationships, religious upbringing, and participation in straight edge subculture that kind of shape people's decision to go vegan, or their paths to veganism. And there's also a study looking at young people's experiences of going vegan in Chile, and identifying that, the stages of this process, and definitely suggesting that it's quite a profound identity change, becoming vegan, which also my research indicates. And I didn't find anything that specifically looked at gender. But then about my study, so these interviews I conducted in 2018 to 19, and with people who identified as men and as vegans based in Finland and Estonia. Average age was like 34, and definitely I have to emphasize, and I do this throughout the book too, that they are a privileged group of men. So they are white, they are ethnic, mostly ethnic Estonian or Finnish. Typically they are middle class, living in urban areas, and most had higher education and worked as professionals. So this is kind of like this, the way they're situated really shapes their vegan transition and their experience, and also their lives as vegans, and giving them a lot of advantages, definitely. And these interviews I conducted were kind of in-depth and narrative interviews, and focused on, it was kind of like a life history in a way. I asked them to talk about their how and why they went vegan, and then about different aspects of veganism and what it means for them in their lives. And then just very shortly, I wanted to highlight some main findings. And the narratives of becoming vegan were constructed around three motivations: non-human animals, environment, and health. So this is definitely not surprising, because these are the kind of themes that figure also in popular representations, although I guess health mostly, and we've been talking about how non-human animals are often missing in those representations of veganism, but in environment is increasingly present. So it was in a way easy for the men to use these as narrative resources as well. And it was typical to start with one of those motivations, but gradually more of them, or all of them, became important for most of the men. And I kind of, there's this division of vegans, or in vegan communities as well. And we talk often about ethical vegans, environmental vegans, and health vegans. And definitely, yes, this kind of divide was there in my interviews as well, to a big extent. But also I kind of problematize this, contest this somewhat, because there were these experiences that, men started out with health or environmental reasons initially, but then they kind of became immersed in information about veganism, and basically they ended up, being vegan for the animals. That was very typical, or like for all of those reasons. So it really, this kind of one reason, maybe like health veganism, that is often many vegans have very maybe negative attitudes towards that. So it can lead to this other kinds of veganism for the animals, let's say. And yeah, so definitely also what I challenge is, like, I think there are these ideas that, maybe veganism starts with like some moral development or some intellectual awareness, and then we take this rational action to become vegan based on facts, but in my my interview suggested that like an important path. I mean, this was also there, that of course it started with this intellectual reasoning, but another important path was kind of through just some material experience that sometimes seemed almost random, like that actually the plant-based food was just available, or some kind of very bodily experience of not wanting to eat meat anymore. So like, and these intellectual reasons came later. So definitely there are these, I kind of explained in the chapter too, that there are these biographical factors and very kind of cultural, material, interpersonal, relational aspects that enable and facilitate men's adoption of veganism, also gender as well, importantly. And I did try to also, based on these narratives, to kind of identify some of the elements and circumstances that are conducive to men's vegan transition. And I tried to very shortly say some of those things. And I tried to divide them into like micro, meso, and macro levels, although of course they all are interrelated. And definitely on the micro, like individual level, there were these prior values and views that the men held, like pacifist views, and also egalitarianism, so they were like saying that gender equality was important to them already before going vegan, and questioning established gender norms and also ways of doing masculinity. And this kind of anti-violence, non-violence worldviews. And then some of the practices that I could highlight here is kind of some alternative performances of masculinity. For instance, and that was something I didn't, it was quite a surprise to me, but it was such a prominent thing in the interviews that, so in Estonia and Finland, the military service, army service for men is compulsory. But so several men had opted out of it, and they had done this alternative civilian service. And they kind of said that, like that army service was just, not, the army is not an institution I can support, and it's like I don't fit in there. And so so they kind of contested that norm that men should be going to that army service. And so kind of experiences of living with a non-human animal, maybe as a teenager too, were talked about as significant, and kind of developing a connection to this individual. And of course, kind of engaging a lot with these films and reading books about veganism and all these like Earthlings and What the Health and all these kind of films are very prominent in the narrative. So I think they have quite a important role in the vegan transition process. And then I could also maybe mention here, kind of I think what is conducive is pursuing some kind of degrees and working in sort of feminized areas of work. That was also became evident from the narratives. On the relational community meso level, I kind of identified this kind of being surrounded by vegans is important, and also in kind of maybe not only in vegan activism that many men were not really, they didn't identify as activists, but kind of in other kinds of activism or some social justice activism that they pursued. And also, and this is a very masculine environment, actually, involvement in the straight edge punk movement was present here, actually, with the Finnish men in particular. I definitely think the macro level is really important as well. And I do in the book contrast the Finnish and Estonian societies in that sense a bit, and how these different like social and geographical contexts shape the men's vegan transition in different ways, kind of showing the importance of this macro context. So kind of whether there is institutional support to veganism, and for instance, in that military or the civilian service, whether there is vegan food options available for men is kind of important. And definitely one of the things I think is important is kind of more egalitarian gender norms in society more broadly that are conducive to men's veganism. And throughout all of this, I think this privileged social position of these men is really important. But just shortly to say that actually this kind of incompatibility between men and veganism, in that we see in cultural narratives very much for these privileged men, while they recognize that this is a problem for other men, for themselves, they didn't see a mismatch between, their own masculinity and veganism at all. So it was comfortable, like they could match them really well. And I think this kind of their privileged position again helped do that, like to mitigate some of those incompatibilities. And this is my almost last thing. And I always like to illustrate my presentations with quotes. And here there was such a short time for the presentation that I couldn't really add more, but I just put one here that is, it really like illustrates how those several elements that I mentioned are brought together, like discursive, material, emotions are here, embodiments, certain biographical events and favorable circumstances that kind of facilitate and that vegan transition. So this quote is by, let's call him Martin, an Estonian man, and he said, he read the book and had these ideas that he agreed with, and they talked about plant-based eating. So not at all actually veganism, but just plant-based eating. So he said, I thought, okay, I had just moved out of my parents' home and I lived alone for the first time. This created some sort of freedom, and I started to make new choices. I then tried 1 day a week to eat plant-based, which soon became 3. But I had in the house some foods with meat that I had previously bought. And so I thought, let me just eat them, otherwise they'll go bad. So for Wednesday night's dinner, I ate some piece of meat with cheese. And after that, I felt this awful stomachache. And after that, I did not want meat. It was such a powerful experience. After this, I have never eaten meat due to this pain, just not to feel this kind of pain again. So going vegan happened gradually within 2 or 3 months. At first, I gave up meat and ate the rest dairy, basically, he means. And then I started investigating. I remember I watched a film. I can't remember what it was, but it must have been a documentary. I remember watching it, and at one point I paused it and just walked back and forth in the room, shook my head in disbelief and thought, what? How is this possible? Some free-range meat producers talking about doing what they are doing because they love animals. I started to have some thoughts that I never had before. It was wild. It opened a new perspective on things that I had never thought about before. It was quite shocking. At this point, you become really angry at all of this because you suddenly understand the truth and want to declare it to everyone. So it opened a new perspective on things I had never thought about before. So I became vegan within 2-3 months. So really, I think this is really kind of encapsulates some of the things I'm trying to like say, that how complicate this vegan transition process, how there are these all kinds of different material discursive like dimensions in it. Okay. And yeah, so definitely going vegan, it's not this an individual pursuit of an isolated rational actor, but which is actually a very masculinized figure typically. So it's a very relational process. And yes, I talked about blurring these boundaries between the material, embodied and discursive reason and emotion. And also blurring the divide between, at least such a strict divide between these different kinds of veganisms, like ethical, environmental, and health veganism. And I think whenever we study vegans, the way they are situated socially is really important. Like privileged vegans or less privileged ones, it really shapes their vegan transition. And actually for these men, largely these privileges remained unacknowledged. There was some acknowledgement in some areas, but largely they really didn't really consider those privileges important. And yes, so becoming vegan was experienced as compatible with masculinity for these men. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. I can see a bunch of chatter in the chat. Does anyone have questions they would like to ask, or have we got any hands up? I'll bring up the thing so I can see if we have any hands up. Can we start with Cameron?
Hi, yeah, really interesting. Thank you. I'm just starting my PhD in looking at vegans and masculinity, and I sort of want to focus on sort of like activism and like sort of vegan activists. So I kind of got two questions, if that's a bit cheeky, but so my first question was just one thing that you mentioned about like the straight edge and punk movement. I think that was really interesting. Whether you could talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's, you know, on one hand, you got the, I guess, a movement that's quite associated with kind of violence or kind of like certain masculine energy, but in quite an anti-authoritarian way. But at the same time, it's got this association, yeah, with like being like quite a mecca for like veganism and stuff like that. And how that's kind of quite contrast to both your vegan, you know, muscle builder, kind of bodybuilder men, but also maybe the sort of the ideas of more of like a feminized vegan. And yes, and my second question would just be, as someone who's just entering in the field, where do you sort of see the future of this research, or what things do you think could be interesting to kind of take this research forward, moving forward?
Yes, thank you very much. Really good questions. Yeah, about the straight edge punk movement, this came up with the Finnish interviews. That's also very interesting in terms of the kind of social, historical, geographical context. In Estonia, you really didn't have that thing. It's because Estonia was under the Soviet occupation, and the kind of social movements you know, developed differently and later on in a way. But yes, so there was a particular group of Finnish men for whom being part of the scene, they identified as really important in the vegan transition. And they were men who, this kind of movement gave them some kind of, in their words, some kind of, you know, kind of a sense of belonging, and also like sense of hope, because they felt quite alienated from this alcohol and meat-centric culture, and they found those masculinities, norms of masculinity in Finland quite problematic. So this movement was somehow showing them some different ways of doing masculinity. Although, as you note here, and as also previous literature has suggested, that this is that movement itself actually reproduces kind of hegemonic masculinity in important ways, and it's being critiqued from that perspective. But those men actually, they didn't kind of touch upon those aspects. They kind of just talked about how important that movement was for them, like in terms of becoming vegan. But actually, these were men who were very sort of pro-feminist and yeah, and also this movement, they said, like gave them this understanding of like how different oppressions are interrelated. So that was interesting. And about the kind of future of this research, it's a huge question, and I do have in the book, actually the book ends with this like possible future research agendas, and maybe one that I could just highlight here, that I think it's really important you know, to research individual vegan men, and as I do myself in my book, but it's really also really important to look at the structural macro level and actually institutions and kind of the role that masculinity plays in that context, kind of hindering or facilitating the transition to like a larger transition to veganism, because I think institutions are so important. And men and masculinities play such an important role, because most kind of institutions and you know, large global organizations, companies are dominated by men. So I think that could be one like really important area of research. That's very shortly. Thank you.
Right, and Alex, did you have a question?
Yes, that was fantastic. I very much enjoyed listening to that presentation. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, because I think we share a little bit of the literature here. So much of this research comes already from the UK and the US. I was wondering if there was anything specific about Estonia and Finland that might have borne out in your research as far as vegan masculinities go. I'd be interested to hear about that. And thank you again.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's a great question too. And partly also why I kind of started to do this research in that context. Well, of course, I'm based in Estonia myself, and I know it like better than some other contexts. But yes, I found that most of it is from Anglo-American context. In fact, I think it's like a lot of it is so similar in a way that the kind of these privileged men in Estonia and Finland, their sort of ways of doing masculinity, their practices of veganism are so similar to what we see in the West in a way. Maybe one thing that some of the stereotypes they might confront, you know, in the Nordic climate is very cold, and so there's the myth, like, you know, that you have to sustain yourself through eating animal products, because otherwise how do you survive the winter? So maybe that's some additional kind of cultural thing, or like a representation that they are faced with in a way. I thought also that the military kind of service aspect was interesting, because in many kind of Anglo-American countries, well, in some you do, but in many you don't really have it compulsory for men. It was interesting how vegan men navigate this institution. And I think also this, yeah, the kind of the way that masculinities are configured. Estonia is more conservative than Finland in terms of gender relations and masculinities, and so that was also interesting to look at, as well as I think, yeah, alcohol culture is really big, and I think that's part of like norms of masculinity. So the way that those vegan men navigate, that was also fascinating for me to look at. Maybe these are some of the very short kind of things. Yeah, thank you.
So I think we've got 2 questions in here that I can see. I'm going to ask Matthew's first because it looks a bit more straightforward, and then I've got one for you and Alex to answer together. So Matthew asked a question about the age dimension. Were there noticeable differences in terms of the age of participants and the age of becoming vegan, as well as chronological age?
Mm-hmm. So they were like they ranged from 18 to 56, and mostly they were like in their late 20s, early 30s. And like I'm trying to, yeah, like that's a good question. I should have probably done a more like some quantification. I looked at like actually what was the average age of becoming vegan, and it wasn't so. But yeah, it was sort of like there were men who had been vegan for decades, and some had gone vegan just a few months, you know, prior to the interview. So yeah, so it was a bit different, and so it was kind of interesting to see also like those who were just like very freshly on that path and what they were like saying and learning about veganism, versus those who had this, like they had been vegan for maybe 15 years and they looked back at how veganism and the experience of being a vegan has changed in their respective countries. So I had that from those who had been vegan longer, like that looking back experience was very interesting. Yeah, I don't, maybe I could have looked at that age specifically more, but maybe that's something, yeah, for now.
That's okay. And Maria has a question for both of you, you and Alex. She asked, in what context can veganism lead to challenging patriarchy for men? So she was thinking if people are immersed in patriarchal spaces, keeping their privilege of masculinity is pretty much at hand. So is there any context where veganism might lead to people challenging patriarchy? So I don't know if Alex, you want to pop up as well.
Yeah, well, like I could, this is one of the trickiest questions. And I have some kind of discussion on that in the book, and I don't think there's some good neat answer, but it's also like this distinction between kind of discourses and kind of egalitarian views and ideals versus like material practices, and that's really huge. So one thing is like practicing veganism, I think for men in itself is quite significant, but I think it can never be enough. It's always like there has to be engagement with other social justice issues. I think that's really important. But yeah, like one thing that I also bring up in my book is this. Well, one thing is like just doing masculinity differently, but then the other thing is like this, the material inequalities, and this category man itself and men's association with that is problematic, because through that category a lot of inequalities are reproduced. So I don't have a good answer. Basically, what I say is that vegan men, I think in some small way, do challenge patriarchy, gender inequalities, but then not in a profound way, I would say. At least the men I interviewed in the context that I did. Yeah.
I'm not sure I have a compelling one either. It's really tricky, and I don't think there are many contexts where that happens, based on my research. I would say that education was pretty clearly, for the people I spoke to, predictive of more engagement with more intersectional issues, particularly feminism. A lot of the older people I spoke to as well were more engaged when it came to more reflexively thinking about their masculinity, I mean. Definitely there were some people I spoke to that were more ingrained in gym culture that I would argue weren't thinking about this at all. Using terms like alpha and that sort of thing. Not the cup of tea we might be going for as vegans, but again, there's just so many variables here, and I only interviewed 10 people, so I'm not sure I have a compelling answer to that.
No, it's very interesting. I'm conscious that our next session is in half an hour and you're not going to get much of a break, but Erica has asked if Alex, Kadri or Cameron, if any of you have references for research on gender and veganism for under 18s or people under 16 specifically. So I don't know if you have any recommendations, but if you do, maybe you could pop those in the chat. And we might leave it there. Thank you to all of our presenters. That was